Welcome to the second module of the class. In this module, we're going to spend the next 3 weeks studying classical logic or categorical reasoning. So this particular video is going to cover Chapter 4, Sections 4.1 and 4.2. And these are the really basic concepts that you'll need to know to make sense of this entire section of the course. Now, this form of logic dates back to Aristotle, and one of the more interesting aspects of this study is that for the bulk of our history, it has been assumed that Aristotle was just right. One of the few things that philosophy thought it had settled had to do with logic. And it wasn't until about 150 years ago that this form of logic was challenged significantly by a number of other thinkers. So to cut to the chase here, you should know by now that we are studying deductive argument forms. That's what this class is about and really what formal logic is about. And in terms of the types of arguments that we're going to look at, this constitutes a sort of short list. We have the immediate inference, which we'll talk about in this module, and then the syllogism. And again, the syllogism is pretty much the workhorse of deductive reasoning. Now notice there are a number of different types of syllogisms. In this particular module, it turns out we're only dealing with one. So what we will be studying here has to do with immediate inferences and then ultimately categorical syllogisms. And of course, that makes sense. We're dealing with categorical logic or reasoning, and the categorical syllogism is the defining feature of this kind of logic. The others, hypotheticals, disjunctives, and dilemmas, are going to be an important part of studying propositional logic. So to make sense of this kind of logic or reasoning, it's important to understand that everything in this is built around what are called categorical propositions. This is why it's called categorical reasoning. And so our first basic step here, the first module, is going to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out exactly what a categorical proposition is and what are the logical implications of these kinds of statements. So a categorical proposition is a statement that asserts a relationship exists between different classes or categories of things. So to offer you some examples of categorical propositions, though not in standard form, but rather in ordinary terms, examples like some historians are extremely gifted writers. And notice what we get here is a claim about the class or category of historians in its relationship to the other class of things called extremely gifted writers. Or if we look at something like some jets can travel faster than the speed of sound. Notice what we have is on one side the class or category of jets, and on the other we have things that can travel faster than the speed of sound. So again, the basic idea of a categorical proposition is that we're taking one class or category and we're asserting it has some sort of relationship to a different class or category of things. So the next thing we need to do is talk about the idea of standard form. As we'll see in this class in dealing with formal logic, the concept of a standard form is going to be very important. What you'll find is over and over again, one of the more challenging aspects of dealing with logic is to take ordinary language and the way we actually talk and express ourselves when we reason, and then convert it into a standardized form that makes it easier to work with. So in its standard form, a categorical proposition will have exactly 4 different parts or pieces, and those must show up in a very distinct order. So the first piece of a categorical proposition is what we call the quantifier. And essentially the job of the quantifier is to answer the question, what kind of relationship is it that exists between the different classes or categories of things that we're talking about? The second piece is called our subject term. And the subject term is essentially just a class or category of things. For the most part, it's just a noun. And it is what is being quantified by the quantifier. When I say all members of the NRA, what I'm saying is the quantifier here is giving us an assertion about a distinct relationship between the subject term and what comes after it. So the next piece is simply the copula, and the copula is really just the verb to be, or the word are, sometimes are not, but basically we just stick the verb to be between the subject term and the next class or category of thing that we're talking about. And then finally we get what is called the predicate term. And like the subject term, the predicate term is simply a class or category of things. It's a noun of some sort. So in standard form, a categorical proposition will always have a quantifier, a subject term, a copula, and a predicate term. This formula is very important, and it's one you need to memorize. Quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term, every time in that particular order. Standard form will have this basic formula. So now that we know that a standard form categorical proposition will always have exactly 4 parts and in this distinct order, a quantifier, a subject term, a copula, and a predicate term, the next step is to talk about different types of quantifiers. Now, as has already been mentioned, the job of the quantifier is essentially to tell us what kind of relationship is it exactly that we have between the subject term and the predicate term in the assertion that's being made. And we can distinguish between the different types of standard form propositions by looking at both the quantity and the quality of the proposition. So the quantity essentially is answering the question, how many of the subject are we talking about? And the quality is asking, what kind of relationship does that subject have to the predicate? So it turns out that in standard form, categorical propositions, no matter how messy or complicated they might be in ordinary language, will have only 4 possible forms. All are, no are, some are, and some are not. And so we can take these 4 possible forms and we can distinguish between them in terms of the quantity and the quality of the claim being made. So when we talk about quantity, remember what we're talking about here is how many of the subject term are we talking about that have some kind of relationship to the predicate term? And here we can distinguish between the claims in 2 different ways. One way in which we can talk about the quantity of a claim is to assert that it is a universal claim. And in this case, we're talking about the all and no claims. So all S's or P's, whatever S and P stand for, or no S's or P's would be universal assertions or claims. Or we can talk about particular claims, and this deals with our some claims. Some are, and some are not. So when we talk about a universal claim, in terms of the quantity of the assertion, notice what we're saying here is that we mean every conceivable member of the subject category or class has a relationship to the predicate, no exceptions whatsoever. And if it's a negative here, then we say none, absolutely none. So all and no as a universal claim quite literally means every conceivable member of that class or category. Now, particular claims, on the other hand, are simply asserting there is at least one of that subject that has some kind of relationship to the predicate term. At least one. It could be more. It could be 10. It could be 10 million. And here's the important point, it could even be all of them. We don't really know, but we can say we know that there is at least one of the subject term that has some kind of relationship to the predicate term. And this basic idea about our particular assertions is going to be very important for making sense of at least some of our immediate inferences. So pay very close attention to this idea. We'll sort it out in more detail in a bit here. But the basic idea is that when you see a particular claim, the way your mind should start to translate this is when you see some, think at least one, but maybe all. So that was quantity. We can also talk about the quality of the claim. And remember what quality asserts or is attempting to describe here is it's answering the question, what kind of relationship does the subject term have to the predicate term? And like we saw with quantity, quality really gives us 2 options. So just like with quantity, quality gives us 2 possible options. The first of these is that we can have what are called affirmative claims. Now, an affirmative claim, again, is answering the question, what kind of relationship does the subject have to the predicate? And what it's telling us is that these 2 terms go together, that the subject and predicate somehow have a relation. They're connected by putting them together into a relationship. So when I say all S's or P's, notice I mean every conceivable S in existence goes together with the P or fits into the class or category of P. And when I say some S's or P, what I'm saying is there is at least one of the subject term that somehow goes together or is put into the class of the predicate term. On the other side, we get what are called negative claims. And negative claims are just doing the opposite thing. So in terms of answering the question, what kind of relationship does the subject have to the predicate, a negative claim is saying they're separate from one another. They go away from one another. They don't have any relationship in a sense. So when I say no S's or P's, I mean absolutely no subject terms will ever fit into the class or category of predicate terms. Or if I say some S's are not P's, I'm saying there's at least one S that does not fit into the class or category of P. So the distinction between affirmative and negative is best thought of as essentially either putting together the classes for an affirmative or separating the two classes for a negative. So given that there are exactly 4 possible types of categorical propositions, and given that we can distinguish between different categorical propositions in terms of the quantity and quality of the claim, we can now basically define these 4 possibilities in those terms. So we have, first of all, a universal affirmative claim, which is our all claims. And notice that's saying every conceivable subject in existence goes together with the predicate term. A universal negative, the no claims, are saying absolutely no S's ever are going to fit into the category of P. A particular affirmative is asserting some are, right? And these are essentially saying there's at least one S that goes together with the P, or the subject that goes with the predicate. And the particular negative, the some or not claims, is saying there's at least one S that does not fit into the predicate term. So these 4 possibilities are all we have: universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. Recognizing the fact that no matter what kind of proposition you have, it must fit into one of these 4 possibilities if it's a categorical proposition is going to be an incredibly useful point here as we start wading through the quarter. Now we have these 4 different types of categorical propositions, and tradition has it that we're going to assign them letter designations. You can think of these as kind of names that we give these 4 possibilities, and their names are just a simple letter. And basically what we see is we have an A claim, which is our universal affirmative, the all claims. An E claim is a universal negative, the no claim. The I claim is a particular affirmative, some are. And the O claim is our particular negative, the some are not. Now this is just a matter of being organized. It's not a particularly important idea, but it's one that we will use. It's a very old tradition, and it's something you need to get comfortable with. So as we wade through this, if we call something an A claim, you should know we're talking about a universal affirmative assertion, all S's or P's kind of assertion, and so on. So get comfortable with these terms. I promise you we'll use them over and over again. But it's just a very old way of being organized, and being organized with this material, with really all of logic, is key to making sense of it. So what precisely are the logical implications of these various types of categorical propositions? So let's start with our universal affirmatives, the A claims, or the all S's or P kind of assertions. So the basic assertion being made here is that we know that every conceivable S without exception would have to fit inside the P category. So if we take a look at these circles, the smaller circle is our S circle, and you can kind of think of this as a giant cage holding every conceivable member of that class, every S, let's say dogs. And the P circle, the larger circle, is some other class, let's say mammals. And notice what we're saying is every conceivable dog without exception has to be a mammal. But notice that doesn't mean that every mammal would have to be a dog, or every P has to be an S. So when we have a universal affirmative, we can know that our subject term must always be in the P category, but that doesn't really tell us much information about the P. We don't know if something is a P, whether or not it might be an S. Now, universal negative claim is fairly straightforward. The logical implications of an E claim, a no claim, are basically this. What we're saying is the entire class or category of S, whatever S stands for, is always completely separated from the class of P. I will never ever have something that is an S and a P at the same time. So if we take as a simple example, we might talk about dogs and cats. If S represents dogs and P represents cats, what I'm saying when I say no dogs or cats is that I'll never ever have something that is both a dog and a cat at the same time. So it can't be a dog cat and it can't be a cat dog. So what about our I claims, the particular affirmatives? That is the some S's or P's kind of assertions. Well, keep in mind what we're saying here is that I have the entire class or category of P, and I know that there is at least one S out there that does in fact fit inside that class. There's an S that is both an S and a P. But all I can say is there's at least one. I can't say that there are any more than that. There might be more. There might be 10. There might be 10 million or so on. And I can't tell you if there's anything outside of the class of P that is an S. All I know is that there is at least one of the S's out there that is in fact a P. So if we say something like some snakes are pythons, what I'm saying is there is at least one S out there, one snake that is in fact a python, but I don't know if there's more than one, and I can't say that there are any outside of it that aren't. So the some are not claims, our O claims, or our particular negative claims are pretty much the same thing, but in reverse. In other words, what we're saying here is there is at least one S out there that does not fit anywhere whatsoever into the P category. Now, there might be some S's that are P's, we don't know, and there might be even more out there that are S's but not P's. But I do know for certain, or at least I'm claiming to know, that there is at least one S out there that does not fit into the category of P, that is not a P. So if those ideas make sense to you, the next basic concept that we have to deal with is distribution. Now, distribution is an important idea. What we're going to do at this point is introduce it now and then kind of drop it for a while. But I promise you it'll be very important later on once we're dealing with categorical syllogisms. Distribution is an important concept for sorting out a number of logical fallacies that occur in categorical reasoning. So in a categorical proposition, a term is said to be distributed if the claim being made about it in the statement refers to every possible object in that category. Now notice when we talk about the terms here, we're talking about the subject and the predicate in a categorical proposition. So the things that can be distributed are subject terms and our predicate terms. And frankly, what will determine the distribution is the type of quantifier that we're talking about. Because of course, the quantifier is going to tell us what kind of relationship exists about the subject and predicate. And that's going to allow us to determine whether or not a subject is being referred to in terms of every possible member of that category, or if the predicate is being referred to in terms of every possible member of that category. So distribution is actually fairly simple, and for the most part, what you need to do is just memorize which quantifier distributes what. So if we have an A claim or universal affirmative claims, what we're saying is every conceivable S term, the subject term, must be distributed, but the predicate term is not. And the reason for this is fairly simple. If you think about the claim, all dogs are mammals, notice I know something about every conceivable class of dog. Every dog has to be a mammal, but that doesn't tell us anything about every mammal. I don't know anything whatsoever about every mammal being a dog or not being a dog. But in a claim like all dogs are mammals, I know, and I know with certainty, that every conceivable dog has to be a mammal. So with an A claim, we know that our subject term is distributed, but our predicate term is not. In a universal negative claim, our no claims, notice both terms will end up being distributed. And the reason for this is very simple. When I say no dogs or cats, that tells me about every conceivable dog in its relationship to cats, and it also tells me something about every conceivable cat. I know that every dog in existence cannot be a cat, and I know that every cat in existence cannot be a dog for this claim to be true. So when you see an E claim, the subject and the predicate term are both distributed. So the next type of claim we have, our categorical proposition, is our particular affirmative. When I say some S's or P's, basically I'm saying nothing is distributed, because all I know is there is at least one S, but that doesn't give me any universal claim about it. I don't know anything about every S. I know there's at least one. And I don't really know anything about every predicate as well. All I can say is there has to be at least one S in the realm of predicates, but that doesn't tell me in terms of the predicate anything universal about the relationship it has to the subject. Now notice what this means is when I have an I claim, a particular affirmative claim, nothing is distributed. Neither the subject nor the predicate are going to be distributed. So our particular negatives are kind of the quirky ones, but basically what we find with a particular negative is that I do know something about the predicate term universally. There has to be something outside of it, basically. But I don't know anything about the subject term. So with a particular negative, what we find is that the subject term is not distributed, but the predicate term is. Now, frankly, for what it's worth, all you need to do is memorize these. If you don't quite understand exactly why something is or is not distributed, you're still in a very good position to deal with this stuff in a way that's functional. The basic idea, again, with distribution is, am I making some sort of universal claim about that class or category based on the kind of quantifier that I have? So if we look at this in terms of the four possible categorical propositions, what we find is the universal claims, the A claim and the E claims, are distributing the subject term always. And the negative claims, that is my E claim and my O claim, are distributing the predicate. And again, for the most part, really all you need to do is memorize what is and what is not distributed based on each distinct quantifier. Now, this is not how the book does it, but I think this is frankly the easiest way of understanding what's going on with this. And that is basically to look at the four possibilities, and you can either circle what is distributed or put an X by what is not distributed. And this is how it looks. Notice that when we have an all claim, all S's or P's, the subject term is distributed, but the predicate is not. With a universal negative, a no claim, notice the subject is distributed and the predicate is distributed. With a particular claim, some are, we find that the subject term is not distributed and the predicate term is not distributed. So nothing in that kind of claim is distributed. And then when we get to a some or not, we find that only the predicate term is distributed, but the subject is not. So the basic distribution matrix of these four possible categorical propositions are, in all claims, it's just the subject, no claims both, some claims nothing, some are not, just the predicate. So there's a very basic and easy rule to follow to know what is distributed in a single categorical proposition and what is not distributed in a single categorical proposition. And the rule is basically this. If it's a universal, it distributes the subject side. If it's a negative, it distributes the predicate side. You simply have to remember this. Universals distribute subjects, negatives distribute predicates. Now, Hurley offers us a sort of mnemonic device, an easy little phrase to remember this. I personally don't see any use in this, but if it works for you, fantastic, make use of it. I don't see any reason why you'd memorize a mnemonic device to memorize the rule. You might as well just memorize the rule. But either way, his basic claim is unprepared students never pass. Notice universal, subject, negative, predicate. However you memorize this, you just need to memorize the basic rule. So notice in our distribution matrix or scheme here, if you just look straight down the S category, everything that's a subject, the top two are universals, and so the subject is distributed, and then the second and bottom one are negatives, and the predicate term is going to be distributed. So universals distribute the subject side of a categorical proposition, negatives distribute the predicate side. And again, frankly, you just need to memorize this. So that's an end to this particular video. What we covered here basically deals with Chapter 4, Sections 1.1 and 1.2. And these are very basic concepts about categorical propositions. What you will find in this section is that what we have basically are really simple ideas, a whole bunch of them that are going to start piling on top of each other into a system. So you need to make sure you understood every little piece of this particular puzzle here, what a categorical proposition is, what kind of assertion it's making. You need to understand the basic idea of standard form, the idea of a quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term in that order every time. You need to be able to recognize that there are only four possibilities when it comes to categorical propositions and standard forms. You need to understand quantity and quality. You need to understand distribution. So sit down and get comfortable with these ideas. If you don't understand them, it will make everything else that comes after much more difficult. So if you have any questions about the material, feel free to contact me and I'm happy to discuss it with you.